My sister mocked me backstage at Paris Fashion Week, then froze. When the chairwoman said she designed the entire line. They say every designer remembers their first sketch. For me, it was a halter dress drawn on the back of a diner napkin while waiting for my sister Sabine to finish ballet class. I was 12. The waitress spilled cranberry juice on it by accident, but I kept it anyway. It still lives in a shoebox under my bed, yellowed, wrinkled, and a little sweet-smelling from time. I'm Calandra Morrow. I'm 34 now. Once I was the top student in my class at Parsons School of Design. Now I live in the shadows of a world I helped build, but was never allowed to claim. I don't own a brand. I don't walk red carpets. My name isn't sewn into labels or whispered backstage at Paris Fashion Week. But if you've followed luxury fashion in the last decade, chances are you've seen my work on runways and magazines on celebrities. You just didn't know it was mine. The last time my name appeared on anything public, I was 18. Parsons had mailed me a heavy envelope acceptance with scholarship. I cried on the kitchen floor. My mother, still recovering from heart surgery, said it was the first time she saw me truly glow. My father hugged me, then turned to Sabine and said, "Looks like your sister's going to outshine you, kid." He meant it as a joke. Sabine didn't laugh. A week later, I got home from my shift at the bakery and found my scholarship letter on the kitchen counter, opened, smudged, and creased. My father stood by the sink with Sabine and said, "This family can't afford to split attention right now. Your mother's still healing. Sabine needs to focus on auditions. You've always been the steady one. You can reapply next year." But I knew the truth. Sabine had taken my portfolio, my sketches, color palettes, construction notes, and submitted them as part of her own last-minute application. Parsons accepted her with conditional merit aid. She got the plane ticket. I got the grocery list. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I nodded and cleaned the kitchen. That's what I was trained to do, support the vision, not star in it. For years, I worked in the quiet corners of her brand. She'd call at midnight and say, "I need something moody draped like fog over Florence, but still wearable," and I'd sit up sketching until my wrist locked. The next morning, I'd email a sketch. A week later, it'd walk down a runway under her name. My parents were proud. They'd point at a Vogue spread and say, "Our Sabine's a genius." I'd smile, and then I'd do the laundry. It wasn't that I lacked ambition. I just didn't have space to dream. Sabine was lightning, charismatic, tall, photogenic. She knew how to look through a lens and make the world believe she invented the light. I was the overcast sky behind her doing the quiet work of atmosphere. The year I turned 30, I began losing feeling in my right hand. At first, it was a tingle like I'd slept on it wrong. Then came the stiffness. The doctor called it early onset inflammatory arthritis, stress-induced mostly. He asked about repetitive motion, cold environments, lack of sleep. I laughed. "You just described Fashion Week prep." When I told Sabine, she paused only long enough to glance at her phone. "Well, good thing I don't need you like I used to," she said. "Your hands haven't been that creative lately anyway." The cruelty didn't land like a slap. It sank like a stone. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was familiar. Sabine had always known how to make someone feel like a room they weren't supposed to be in. I went home that night and dug out my old sketchbooks. They were all signed. CM bottom right corner, my little rebellion. I ran my finger along the edges of pages and realized something I'd spent more than a decade drawing a world I couldn't live in. Designs that fit women like Sabine, confident, celebrated, seen. But what about women like me? A week later, I received a letter addressed to C. Morrow. It was a government mailer confirmation of approval for a $25,000 federal grant for Latinx women in design. Except I hadn't applied. I wasn't even designing publicly. But someone had. Someone who used my full legal name, birth date, and background info. It didn't take long to figure it out. Sabine. I confronted her in her office, surrounded by bolts of imported silk and framed magazine covers. "You used my name for a federal grant," I said. She didn't deny it. "You weren't using it," she said with a shrug, adjusting a pearl earring. "And technically, you are Latinx. They ask for representation, right? You got represented. And the money, production costs, travel, PR. It helped the whole brand, our brand. "You want me to cut you a check. Would that make you feel better?" I didn't answer. There was no number that would make me feel whole. What she took wasn't money. It was story. It was lineage, and she'd erased it with a click and a signature. The next week, I received a dress in the mail. It was a new design limited edition, she said in the card. When I opened the box, my stomach turned. It was my design. One I'd drafted in 2019. My notes, my neckline, my fabric pairing. Only the label read Sabine. I folded the dress back into the box and set it beside the others. Yes, there were others. She sent them every year like trophies, or reminders. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and whispered something I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud in over a decade. I want my name back. The day I decided to reclaim my name, I didn't start with confrontation. I started with fabric. There's a warehouse in Queens where remnants from top-tier design houses get sent silks misprinted by 1mm linens that aged in the sun just a touch too long. For the past 6 months, I'd been going there on Thursdays. Nobody there knew my name. They just called me the quiet one who likes gray. But that week, I didn't buy gray. I bought crimson. The color of risk, the color of things that don't hide. Back in my studio, if you could call my converted laundry room that I laid out the bolts and ran my fingers over the weave. My hands still ached if I worked too long, but they remembered how to see shapes where no one else did. I wasn't ready for a full collection. I just needed one piece, one dress. Not for the runway, not for sale. For proof. That same week, I got a call from Nadia Choi, an old classmate from Parsons, who now worked as a creative director at Form, an independent fashion magazine that had never bowed to the industry's cliques. "Cal," she said, cautious like the name might slip through her fingers. "I didn't think you still had this number." "I didn't either," she admitted. I was cleaning out my old phone. Then, something popped up. She sent me a link. A digital spread of Elle International featuring Sabine. The headline, "From Paris Napkins to Global Icons, Sabine Morrow on Genius Grit and Going Solo." The article told a charming story about a teenage Sabine sketching her first design on a napkin at a cafe in the Marais. A waitress had spilled cranberry juice. Sabine had smiled through it. The stain made it better, more romantic, more hers. I felt something between laughter and nausea. The story wasn't just stolen, it was mine, word for word. Down to the juice. "I figured you saw it," Nadia said softly. "But if you ever want to talk, or publish, even just a sketch or two." I hesitated. "I'm not sure if that world still wants me." "I do," she said. It had been so long since anyone in fashion had said that without needing something. The next week, I brought her 3 sketches. Originals, dated, signed. She flipped through them in silence, then looked at me like someone rereading a favorite book under better light. "You were always the one," she murmured. "She just had better lighting." She offered to feature my sketches in an online gallery, subtle soft launch style. No names in the title, no overt call-out. Just, "The designer's drawer lost pages from New York's unsung hands." I agreed. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about telling the truth in a whisper first before the shout. The post went up the following Monday. I didn't check the numbers. But 3 days later, I got a DM from a woman named Rosalie Dupont, an editor at Maude, a Paris-based style journal known for spotlighting forgotten brilliance. She asked for an interview. She didn't mention Sabine. She only said, "Your hand is familiar. Your restraint, unmistakable." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I sewed. Every stitch calmed something in me that had been electric and unmoored for years. This wasn't about showcasing rage, it was about reclaiming rhythm. The dress I created that week was unlike anything I'd made under Sabine's direction. It didn't scream, it spoke. A deep V-neck softened by accordion pleats. No sequins, no gimmicks, just elegance as confession. The dress didn't carry my initials. It carried my name full fluid stitched in silk thread, Calandra Morrow. I packed it gently and mailed it to Rosalie along with a letter. No declarations, just a story. The real one. 2 weeks later, Maud published an article titled "The Hidden Signature Rediscovering Calandra Morrow." It didn't go viral, but it didn't have to. It reached the right people. One of them was a stylist named Elijah Grant, known in the industry for his candor and refusal to bow to nepotism. He reposted a line from the article, "You can erase credit, but you can't erase craft." Within days, fashion blogs started murmuring, not about sabotage, about style. Someone posted side-by-side images of Sabine's runway designs and my published sketches. The overlap was impossible to ignore. That's when Sabine called. Her voice was buttered steel. "You're embarrassing yourself." "I haven't said your name," I replied. "Not once." "You didn't need to. You dragged your dirty laundry into the public square and let people draw conclusions." "They weren't conclusions," I said. "They were lines I've been drawing for years. The world's just finally seeing them." She hung up. The next day, I received another package. A gift box wrapped in cream ribbon with a card. No hard feelings. Let's keep it elegant. Inside was another dress, one of mine. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between a catalog from an art supply store she hadn't ordered from in years and a pre-approved credit card offer. Calandra nearly threw it away. It was one of those mass-mailed federal notices unmistakable in its red-blue seal and dry, bureaucratic tone. She was used to junk mail being addressed to the apartment's previous tenant, so when she saw her own name printed neatly on the envelope, she paused. The letter was from the Department of Arts and Cultural Development. Her heart beat slightly faster. She hadn't applied for anything. Her name had been nowhere near any applications since her school days at Parsons before everything derailed. She slit the envelope open with the tip of her nail, unfolded the single-page notice, and read, "Congratulations, Calandra Morrow. You have been selected as one of this year's recipients of the Latinx Women in Design Innovation Grant. The federal grant of $25,000 was approved for your proposed portfolio submitted under the Heritage in Motion project." The words turned slippery in her mind. Grant submission Latinx Women in Design. She had never applied. She had never even heard of that portfolio title. And then it hit her like a whisper crawling up the back of her neck. Sabine. There was only one person who had access to her old sketches, her portfolio drafts, and her ethnicity. Calandra was the only member of the Morrow family who qualified as Latinx through their maternal lineage. Sabine had no right, no claim. And yet, she had used Calandra's name, her heritage, her work. She hadn't just taken credit, she had committed identity theft in broad daylight. Calandra sat down the letter still open on her lap. The anger didn't come immediately. It arrived slowly, deliberately, like a fire learning how to breathe. She grabbed her laptop and typed the name of the grant into Google. There it was, last year's winners. And sure enough, under the Heritage in Motion project, the artist bio listed Calandra Morrow, lead creative at Sabine Studio, NYC. A total fabrication. There was a photo. It was Sabine. Sabine smiling in a navy blazer, standing next to a board of abstract fabric cuttings. Calandra remembered that board. She had built it. With her hands. She printed the bio out and pinned it next to the grant letter on her corkboard. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about fame. It was about theft, careful, deliberate, soul-deep theft. That evening, she waited until the city had quieted and the studio across the hall dimmed. She walked 2 blocks through the wind to Sabine's penthouse showroom. It wasn't unusual for her to drop by. She was still listed on paper as a consultant, though the last consultation had been over 3 years ago. Sabine answered the door wearing a silk robe and holding a wine glass as if she'd been expecting paparazzi instead of family. "I got a letter," Calandra said, simply holding up the envelope like a badge. Sabine didn't blink. "You're going to have to narrow that down." "The federal design grant," Calandra replied. "It had my name on it, my project, my heritage. You used my identity, and you kept the money." There was a pause, so small it could have been missed. Then Sabine stepped aside with an exaggerated sigh, letting her in. "Don't be dramatic, Calandra. You weren't going to use it. You don't even have a portfolio anymore." "I didn't need one for you to build your empire on it," Calandra said, her voice tightening. Sabine tilted her head with something close to pity. "You're acting like you've been erased. But I kept your name alive, Calandra. You should be thanking me for putting it anywhere at all." The room felt suddenly colder. Calandra could feel the threads of their years together stitched tight with obligation, apology, and control beginning to fray. She left without another word. 3 days later, a package arrived at her door. Inside was a dress from Sabine's latest line, a fitted silk column in dusk, rose embroidered with delicate seed pearls. Attached was a handwritten card, limited edition. "Just for you." Calandra didn't need to open her sketchbook to know she had designed it. It was from 2019, something she had drawn during a particularly stormy winter when her arthritis had flared, and she'd worked entirely with her non-dominant hand. She remembered sketching it by candlelight in her mother's old kitchen, drawing inspiration from the way icicles melted into morning light. She hadn't shown it to anyone but Sabine. And now it was in her hands again, labeled sold and trademarked under someone else's initials. She draped the dress on her mannequin. She didn't destroy it. She didn't send it back. She simply let it sit there, silent testimony to a history too complex to simplify into rage. But she began documenting everything. She scanned sketches. She searched emails. She gathered handwritten notes, receipts, garment tags, mood boards, anything with her original name date or annotation. It wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about proof, not for the press. Not even for Sabine, for herself, because erasure is not always sudden. Sometimes it comes quietly over years until one day you look up and realize your entire life has been folded into someone else's story. But not anymore. Not for Calandra Morrow. The article came out the morning after a cold front swept through the city. Calandra was at the kitchen table in her faded robe, nursing a lukewarm cup of Earl Grey, when Maya burst into the brownstone without knocking, waving a glossy copy of Harper's Bazaar. "Tell me you've seen this," she said, voice tight. "Tell me this is a parody and not the world we live in." Calandra blinked and took the magazine from her. The cover read, "Sabine Morrow, the vision behind the veil." Her sister stood tall in an ivory silk pantsuit, her hair swept like a French chignon, lips poised as if she had just whispered genius. Calandra skimmed the first few lines, standard fashion fluff, until her eyes snagged on a quote bolded and center justified. "The first time I saw the shape, the flow, I was in a cafe near the Seine. I took a pen and drew the gown on a napkin. I still have it framed." The article continued with talk of Sabine's intuitive grasp of lineage and modernity, then included a photograph of the now famous Leda gown, the collection's centerpiece. It was soft, fluid, deceptively simple, just like the sketch Calandra had made 4 years ago alone at their mother's kitchen table the day after her mother had come home from chemo. She remembered the way her hand had trembled slightly while sketching how she'd drawn each seam with intention, trying to honor softness and strength at once. She'd taped it on the fridge and written in the corner, "For you, M." A week later, it was gone. Sabine had told her it got tossed during a deep clean, and now, apparently, it hung in a Paris apartment, framed, fictionalized, and stolen. Maya leaned across the table. "That dress was yours. I remember you showing me the draft in your sketchbook, the one you tore out after Sabine made a face." Calandra nodded, mouth dry. "It wasn't even a napkin," she said softly. "It was a recycled grocery list. I remember because I sketched on the back of a note that said, 'Lentils, almond milk, eggs.'" "You've got to do something." Maya's voice cracked. "She's not just taking credit anymore. She's rewriting history." "She's always rewritten history," Calandra murmured. "This is just a better font." That night, Calandra sat alone in her small studio surrounded by the sketchbooks she had kept in locked boxes. Dozens of them. Some battered, some still pristine. She pulled one labeled Legacy opened to the page with the original Leda gown and stared at the date in the corner. The ink had faded, but her initials were still visible, CM. She photographed it carefully, then went to her desk drawer and took out a heavy cream envelope, the kind with an embossed return address in silver. CFDA, Council of Fashion Designers of America. She had received it back when she was a senior at Parsons, congratulating her for a junior year showcase that never happened because her mother had fallen ill again and she'd chosen to fly home. The letter had come from the desk of Evelyn Sarto, then an associate professor, now the chairwoman. Calandra had once written her a thank you note in purple ink. She wondered if the woman even remembered her. Still, she wrote a short letter. Not accusatory, just factual. She included photocopies of 4 sketches each with a date, a signature, and a note about the original garment. She didn't ask for recognition. She didn't threaten legal action. She ended with, "I'm not trying to undo what's been built. I'm simply sending these because I believe stories deserve the truth." The next morning, she dropped the envelope at the corner mailbox, tucked between gas bills and charity flyers. She told no one, not even Maya. 2 weeks passed. Sabine went on a press tour grinning under studio lights and fake tears claiming the Leda gown was the most personal piece I've ever created. She told Vogue that her biggest inspiration had always been solitude. "When I'm alone," she said, "I feel the clearest. I've never collaborated. I wouldn't even know how." Calandra watched the interview on mute. She didn't cry. She just walked to her studio and pulled out an older sketch from a file marked firsts. It was the exact silhouette Sabine had worn to the Met Gala that year. A silhouette that had begun as a concept during Calandra's first month back home, drawn while watching their mother sleep in a recliner, oxygen tubes coiled like thread. She traced her fingers along the lines. Then she turned to the page and flipped through the entire book. Every design, every stitch had a memory behind it, not just artistic vision, human story. And now it was a ghost, paper ghosts. No one had seen them, but they'd shaped a world anyway. That night, she walked through Manhattan's garment district like a woman searching for a pulse. Lights buzzed overhead, models floated past her on screens outside fashion houses, and for a moment, she felt invisible. But then she passed a storefront where a single vintage dress sat displayed under soft yellow light. The tag read, "No label. Unknown designer. Estimated 1970s. And Calandra smiled. It wasn't about being famous. It was about being found. At home, she pinned one of her signed sketches, just one, on the corkboard above her bed. For the first time in years, she wrote underneath it, "This was mine." Then she stared at it until her eyes blurred and whispered, "Not anymore." The winds outside shifted again. Paris would come next, and this time Calandra wouldn't be invisible. The Palais Garnier shimmered in lights that night, the marble corridors echoing with clipped heels and camera clicks. Paris Fashion Week wasn't just about fashion, it was theater legacy and performance all rolled into one. Calandra Morrow moved through the backstage area like a ghost in her own story clipboard and hand headset tight against her ears. She wasn't listed on the official credits, of course. She never was. But the lineup in front of her 15 garments under the theme Mother lines bore her soul in every seam. She'd spent 3 months refining the pleats on the Marielle gown, named silently after their mother. Its silhouette was structured yet soft, regal yet forgiving, just like the woman who had once held their family together with the sheer force of dignity. Sabine had tweaked one sleeve and changed a hemline enough to claim creative license. The rest was Calandra's. Every curve of fabric on that runway had once been a pencil stroke on her sketch pad. "Lights in 90, a voice called out over the tech line. Sabine was in her dressing room being primped by 3 stylists, her energy electric. She thrived in moments like these, the applause she hadn't yet earned already reflecting in her pupils. Her dress for the night, a deep plum-sheath gown, hugged her figure and bore a small embroidered tulip at the shoulder, a design Calandra had drawn during their mother's last hospital stay. Sabine had asked for a soft emblem, something to honor the theme. Calandra had handed her the sketch without a word. She always did. "Calandra," Sabine said breezily as she walked past, not even glancing over her shoulder. "Be sure to steam look 8 again. There's a wrinkle in the collar, and I'm not about to be accused of showing lazy tailoring in Paris." Calandra pressed her lips together, nodded silently, and turned to the rack. Look 8 was flawless. She'd triple-checked every inch, but she smoothed the collar again anyway. As models lined up, the music rose like a tide. Sabine stood near the curtains, grinning at the swell of anticipation on the other side. She turned to Calandra and added with a smirk, "And hey, thank you for keeping the steamer plugged in." She said it loud enough for two assistants to hear, who chuckled dutifully, eyes darting at Calandra to gauge her reaction. Calandra didn't respond. She focused on adjusting a hemline, her knuckles whitening around the safety pins she held. She wasn't embarrassed. Not anymore. What she felt was something quieter, colder, a kind of calm that only came when a person had finally stopped asking for fairness. Then the curtains rose. The collection walked out like memory itself. The muted palette dusty rose, faded aubergine buttercream slate echoed their childhood bedroom walls, the linens their mother used to press the colors of the Sunday dresses they wore to church. The crowd was silent reverent until the fourth look hit the runway, and then a wave of whispered awe passed through like a ripple. Sabine basked in it. She stood in the wings with her arms folded, nodding along like a conductor of silent music. Calandra watched from behind the makeup table, arms crossed, the emotion bubbling up inside her. Not pride, not even resentment. Just the aching recognition that this was her story being narrated by someone else's voice. After the finale walk, Sabine stepped on stage to a standing ovation. The models fanned out behind her, the spotlight pooling at her feet. A reporter from Women's Wear Daily leaned toward the edge of the stage and shouted, "Sabine, this collection is breathtaking. Who inspired it?" Sabine smiled, tilting her head just so. "No one in particular," she said. "I work alone. I always have." Calandra felt her jaw tighten. Behind her, one of the interns dropped a hanger. No one moved to pick it up. Sabine held her hands in the air. "But of course," she added with a grin, laced in mock affection, "I do have to thank my little sister Calandra for keeping the steamer plugged in. Couldn't have done it without her." The room laughed politely. The laughter stung more than the words. Later that evening, Sabine held court at the after-party, surrounded by editors, buyers, and celebrity stylists, sipping champagne under a crystal chandelier. Calandra sat near the back beside a ficus plant watching her own dress. The Harriet silk coat graced the cover of a fashion blogger's phone. No one knew it was hers. That had been the arrangement. No credit, no name, just silence neatly stitched. A woman in her late 50s walked over. Elegant, understated, with horn-rimmed glasses and a subtle brooch on her lapel. "You're Calandra." "Yes." Calandra stood awkwardly. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Beatrix Lucian," the woman said. "Chairwoman of the CFDA. I was your sketching professor once a long time ago." The breath caught in Calandra's throat. "Yes, I remember you. I haven't forgotten your hands." "Or your lines," Beatrix said. She nodded toward the runway photos cycling on the large screen across the room. "I saw your signature. In every stitch." Calandra didn't answer. She wasn't sure she could. Instead, she reached into her bag and handed Beatrix a slim manila envelope. "Originals?" Beatrix asked quietly. Calandra nodded. "Signed, everyone." Beatrix tucked the envelope into her coat and said simply, "Then let's begin." That night, back in her hotel room, Calandra laid the Paris edition of Vogue on the table. The title read, "The Rise of Sabine Morrow." She traced the letters with one finger, then opened the final page. The credits listed Sabine as creative director. Artistic vision, Sabine Morrow. Lead designer, Sabine Morrow. Wardrobe development anonymous team. Calandra didn't cry. She didn't tear it up or throw the magazine across the room. She simply opened her sketchbook to a blank page, picked up her pencil, and drew something new. This time, she signed it. Bold and clear. CM. 3 weeks after Paris, the CFDA gala shimmered with the kind of manufactured elegance only the fashion world could pull off. Held at the Met, it was a night of gowns, speeches, and networking disguised as celebration. Sabine had arrived in a velvet gown the color of Cabernet paired with a cape she claimed was a tribute to French surrealism. The press loved it. Cameras clicked like insects around her as she posed on the carpet with flawless ease, the darling of the hour. Calandra sat inside, already tucked near the back, in a simple floor-length black dress with no label. She hadn't come to be seen. She came because she was invited, an envelope delivered quietly by courier signed in looping ink B. Lucienne. There was no mention of what would happen. Just the address and a handwritten note, "Wear something honest." As the room filled, Calandra's fingers trembled slightly around the base of her champagne flute. She wasn't used to being in public. She had spent nearly a decade behind curtains, behind doors, behind other people. And now she sat in a room of sharp eyes, curated reputations, and whispered evaluations. Her dress had no shimmer. Her shoes were 2 seasons out of sync. And yet, she felt steady. For the first time in years, she was not here to disappear. Beatrix Lucienne took the stage with poise that made the room fall still. A quiet hush rippled through the crowd as the CFDA chairwoman adjusted the microphone and surveyed the sea of gowns and tuxedos. This year's gala is more than a celebration, she began. It is a reflection of where we've been and where we must go. Her voice was not loud, but it didn't need to be. She had the kind of authority that made you lean in. This year's finalist for Outstanding American Design is someone whose collections have stunned the industry, someone whose brand has redefined silhouette narrative and restraint. She paused, her gaze resting momentarily on Sabine, who sat poised near the front row, flanked by 2 editors from W. Sabine gave a modest smile, nodding slightly. And yet Beatrix continued, "We received new documentation last month that required us to pause." The room stiffened. In our process of verification, we were sent over 20 original sketches, annotated, dated, and signed. Some are over a decade old. Each matches line for line pieces presented in recent shows under another name. Sabine's expression froze. Her shoulders drew inward slightly, a crack in her perfect composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, these sketches," Beatrix said as an assistant brought a leather folio to the podium, "were sent to me by the actual creator of the designs you know as the Legacy line." The signature on each page reads Calandra Morrow. The name fell into the room like a dropped chandelier. People turned. Heads swiveled. In the silence that followed, cameras reflexively sought out Calandra in the back, the single woman not holding a phone, not whispering to anyone, not crying or smiling, just sitting there still as stone. Beatrix opened the folio and lifted one of the sketches. Projected behind her, it appeared on the large screen, an early version of the Marielle gown. It bore soft pencil notations, silhouette based on 1979 photo of Mom. Hem memory weighted. At the bottom corner, CM, 12.3, 2018. Gasps traveled like static. One designer near the stage leaned toward her companion and murmured, "She's the ghost designer." Beatrix raised her voice gently. "This is not an accusation. It is a correction. Because fashion is not just fabric, it is authorship. And authorship, my friends, matters." Calandra sat motionless. She had imagined this moment in dozens of versions. Some ended in cheers, others in scandal. But nothing could have prepared her for this strange, deep quiet, the kind that settles not just in rooms but in bones. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She just felt known. Sabine stood slowly. Whether to protest or explain, Calandra couldn't tell. But no words came. She glanced toward the screen as another sketch appeared, a coat design from 2 years prior, down to the unique sleeve stitching Calandra had spent weeks refining. Then another. And another. The audience didn't look away. Not from Sabine, and not from the truth now projected 15 feet high. One reporter broke the silence with a whispered, "Oh my God." Beatrix gently closed the folio and stepped back. In light of this information, the board has chosen to reconsider this year's finalist. And in doing so, we reaffirm our commitment to honoring the real work behind the glamour. Then she turned to the audience. "Ms. Calandra Morrow, if you are willing, we would like to extend our recognition. Not as a favor, but as overdue acknowledgement." A spotlight, soft and hesitant, flickered toward the back. Calandra didn't stand. She didn't need to. Her presence had already taken the stage. The applause began slowly. A few claps, then more. Within seconds, the room was on its feet, the sound rising in a wave so sudden it startled her. Calandra blinked, heart racing. Not everyone clapped. Some didn't know what to believe. But most did. And that mattered more than she ever expected. Sabine turned toward her. Their eyes met across the room, one sister standing in a collapsing spotlight, the other emerging quietly from the shadows. Sabine's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound followed. Calandra simply nodded once. Not with malice, not with pity, just finality. She rose slowly from her seat, not to join the stage, not to grab the mic, but to leave. Her story had been spoken not by her, but by proof. That was enough. Outside, in the cool Manhattan air, the noise of the city wrapped around her like a familiar shawl. She stepped onto the sidewalk alone, but lighter. That night she didn't celebrate, she didn't post, she didn't toast. Instead, she went home, pulled out a file of old sketches, and for the first time wrote a label across the folder, not forgotten, just undersigned. Then, on the corner of each design, she signed 3 letters slowly with intention. CM. The gallery space was tucked into a quiet corner of the West Village, a converted piano factory now lit with amber bulbs and framed by raw brick. Outside, the weather had turned gently crisp, hinting at autumn, and the crowd that gathered was a different kind than Calandra was used to, less paparazzi, more pens and sketchbooks. Journalists, fashion students, industry veterans who remembered what it meant to sew by hand, not algorithm. She hadn't sent out formal invitations. Just a small email blast with the subject line, unnamed sketches. One night only. No brand mentioned, no sponsors. Just her name at the bottom. Inside, the walls were lined with craft paper instead of painted drywall pinned with original pencil drafts. Dates and initials appeared in the bottom corners of every page, CM 2013, CM 2017, CM 2020. Above the entrance hung a single hand-lettered phrase, designs without applause, but not without authorship. As guests moved through the room murmuring over the details, the seams, the annotations, the textured story stitched into every page, Calandra stood to the side, her hands clasped in front of her, absorbing it quietly. Maya leaned in and whispered, "I think you just redefined what a retrospective can feel like." Calandra smiled softly, but her nerves were nowhere near settled. Not because of the gallery, because of the unopened box she'd received that morning. It had arrived like all the others over the years, wrapped in cream paper tied with a silk ribbon. Sabine's yearly gift, a limited edition gown bearing Sabine's label, which Calandra knew too well, had been drafted first by her own hand. She hadn't opened it at first, just stared at it on the counter while sipping black coffee, her fingers twitching slightly from her arthritis. But eventually, she unwrapped it. This time, it was one of her oldest designs, a Merlot-colored sheath with an asymmetrical neckline she had once crafted in tribute to their mother's old dance photos. A design she'd never submitted but which Sabine had kept in the vault, and now it seemed claimed as another anniversary edition. Calandra didn't burn it. She didn't scream. She folded it back neatly into the box and brought it with her to the gallery. Now, as the crowd thickened, she placed it on a pedestal beneath a sketch labeled CM 2014 The First Flame. She didn't need to say a word. The contrast between the raw sketch and the polished, label-signed product was louder than anything she could voice. A few guests gasped. One whispered, "It's hers, all along." The buzz rose. And then Sabine walked in. No announcement, no entourage. Just her, in a bone-white suit, sunglasses tucked into her neckline mouth, pressed into a flat, unreadable line. The crowd rippled as if touched by cold water. A few people instinctively moved aside, unsure whether to greet her or ignore her. But Calandra didn't flinch. She stood rooted by the sketches, her back straight, chin lifted. This time she wasn't backstage. She was the show. Sabine's eyes scanned the room, pausing on the wall of sketches, the crowd of designers snapping photos, and finally on the dress. Her mouth twitched, then tightened. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked, voice sharp but low, just loud enough to cut through the hum of conversation. Calandra didn't reply. She didn't need to. Sabine stepped forward, the heels of her boots clicking against the polished floor. "You want credit? Take it," she hissed, her voice rising. "Let's see how far you get without me." And then, like something out of a bad daytime drama, she raised her hand and slapped Calandra. Hard. The sound cracked through the gallery sharp as scissors snapping thread. Gasps rippled. Someone dropped a glass. A young assistant from L nearly shouted, "Oh my God!" Cameras clicked, but no one intervened. Because in that moment, everyone saw it exactly what Calandra had endured in silence for years. The red bloom on Calandra's cheek grew slowly, but her stance never wavered. She simply blinked once, her gaze unwavering. Sabine looked around, perhaps expecting anyone to step in on her behalf. But all she found was silence and judgment. One older designer near the back muttered just loud enough, and she said she worked alone. Sabine stood frozen. She had come thinking she might reclaim the story, take control of the narrative like she always had. But something had shifted. The tide had turned. This wasn't her audience anymore. Calandra slowly turned her face to the crowd, cheeks flushed but voice calm. That she said evenly was the last design that bore her name but came from my hand. There were no cheers, just something better. Stillness, respect, and in it, a shift in power. Sabine backed away slowly, eyes hollow as if she'd suddenly realized how alone she was. No handlers, no sister to shield her. She turned and left the gallery, her silhouette shrinking through the front doors. Maya moved beside Calandra, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Calandra said, then corrected herself. "I'm finally fine." That night, the gallery trended across fashion forums. The slap video went viral within hours, but it wasn't the violence that caught on, it was the truth behind it. Every comment under the clip was a reckoning. Words like gaslighting, erasure, silent genius, and authorship theft filled the threads. The public wasn't interested in pity. They wanted justice, and they saw it. Calandra didn't do interviews that night. She simply stayed until the last guest left, helped fold up chairs, and gathered the sketches herself. One of the last to leave was Beatrix Lucienne. She approached Calandra with quiet dignity and said, "If you're ready." "The world is." Calandra looked down at her hands, still trembling, still sore, but for the first time in years, steady enough to sign her name. She simply nodded. "Then let's begin again." This time, signed from the start. The board meeting was called on short notice, but not a single seat was empty. The long glass table, usually a space for curated applause and champagne toasts, now felt like a courtroom. The silence in the room spoke louder than any of the prepared talking points sitting on legal pads and designer notebooks. Sabine sat at the head of the table, pale under flawless foundation, her arms tightly crossed, as if bracing for a wave. Across from her was Gregory Vance, the brand's chief investor, a man who had once called her a force of nature. Today, he avoided meeting her eyes. It had been less than 72 hours since the gallery incident. Less than a day since the slap video reached 6 million views. The brand's online store had seen a 17% spike in returns within 48 hours, led not by criticism of the clothes, but the woman behind them. Hashtags like "Dar stolen sketches" and "Design by CM" flooded every comment thread. And then there were the editorials, the cut Vanity Fair, even Teen Vogue, all asking the same question: who really built Morrow Atelier? Gregory cleared his throat. "Ms. Morrow, given the events of the past week, the board has voted unanimously to suspend you as creative director effective immediately. This is not a termination yet, but a hold pending internal review." Sabine opened her mouth, then shut it. She looked at the one person in the room who might still defend her, Marta, the brand's head of PR, but Marta stared firmly at her hands, and Gregory continued, We've extended a proposal to Ms. Calandra Morrow to step into a transitional leadership role as interim creative director. A sharp intake of breath across the table. Calandra hadn't spoken yet. She was seated halfway down the table in a neutral black blouse and slacks, no makeup. Her sketchbook closed but visible beside her. No theatrics, no revenge energy, just steady, focused presence. She looked up now, meeting Gregory's gaze. "Thank you, but I'll accept only with 3 conditions." Even Sabine's eyebrows lifted. 1. Calandra said, her voice quiet but unwavering, any new line produced under this brand must credit all contributing designers by name fully and transparently. Gregory nodded. Agreed. 2. She continued, the Mother Lines collection, the one currently being sold as Sabine's solo work, will be re-released with full creative attribution. To me. Another pause. Marta looked up from her hands, and 3rd, Calandra said, softening slightly, I want a portion of this season's profits redirected to establish a scholarship fund for first-gen fashion students, especially those who've had to give their seat to someone else. There was a collective stillness. Even Sabine didn't interrupt. We'll call it the Marielle Fund. Calandra finished. After our mother. Gregory tapped his pen, then looked around the room. Bored one by one, the nods came. Even Marta nodded. Then it's settled, he said. Effective today, you are the interim creative director, and as far as the brand's public voice, will follow your lead. Calandra gave no dramatic smile, no triumphant glance. She simply said, thank you, and closed her notebook. Later that evening, the press release hit the internet. It was simple and clean. Morrow Atelier announces new creative leadership. Calandra Morrow appointed interim creative director. The brand will be restructuring to reflect a renewed commitment to ethical authorship, creative transparency, and restorative storytelling. The Marielle Fund will launch in partnership with the CFDA this fall. The backlash didn't vanish overnight, but the narrative began to shift. Fashion media, always hungry for reinvention, pivoted with speed. Vogue ran a midweek cover story, "The Sister in the Shadows has stepped into the light." The article featured a double-page spread of Calandra sitting beside a wall of her original sketches, each annotated in her handwriting, the date stamps intact. Comments poured in. Not pity, admiration. That kind of quiet strength, we need more of that in design. She doesn't scream. She doesn't rant. She just shows the work and lets it speak. Meanwhile, Sabine stayed silent. Her social media team posted a generic apology that began with, "I'm sorry if anyone felt misled," and ended in total comment lockdown. But Calandra didn't bother engaging. She had no appetite for public spats. Her work had finally found its own oxygen. A week into her new role, Calandra walked into the design studio for the first time not as someone's assistant, but as its leader. She paused at the glass doors, fingers brushing against the cool metal handles, and pushed through. The room was mostly empty late afternoon lull, but a few interns looked up as she entered, startled. One of them, a young black woman with beaded braids, stood up instinctively flustered. "You don't have to stand," Calandra said gently. "We're all builders here." The girl smiled nervously. "It's just, I've been studying your line drawings since college." Calandra tilted her head. "My line drawings." The intern reached into her backpack and pulled out a wrinkled printout, one of Calandra's oldest sketches, The First Flame. "I had no idea they were yours," the girl said. "I found this on a design Tumblr 5 years ago and pinned it to my dorm wall. It taught me that curves didn't have to be perfect to be strong." Calandra felt something tighten in her throat. She took the paper, gently smoothing it with her hand, and said, "Then I guess they did what they were meant to do." That night, Calandra stayed late reviewing fabrics, editing concepts, and writing out her first formal proposal, a new capsule collection called Remnants Pieces, inspired by designs that had never been finished because their authors were pushed out, quieted, or erased. It would be raw, emotional, and nothing like the sleek perfectionism Sabine had always curated. This one would breathe. As she locked up the studio past midnight, she paused at the hallway mirror. For years, she'd avoided reflections, but now she held her own gaze. "I'm not here to take what you built," she whispered as if speaking directly to her sister across time. "I'm here to build what you never let me start." And then she walked down the hall, not fast, not slow, just steady, exactly the way power transfers, quietly, permanently. The table was set for 6, though only 5 had shown up. Roast duck glistened on a silver platter in the center, flanked by bowls of rosemary potatoes wilted charred, and a basket of sourdough rolls Calandra recognized from the same Brooklyn bakery her mother used to love. Her father, Everett, had poured himself a generous glass of Cabernet and was now sipping it slowly, more to fill the silence than for taste. The air was tense, far too formal for a family dinner, but too private for the cameras that used to follow Sabine around like perfume trails. Calandra sat 2 chairs down from him, her posture calm, hands folded neatly in her lap, though her stomach had rejected everything since morning. It was their first full dinner together in nearly 8 years. There had been birthdays, she'd skipped holidays, she'd deflected anniversaries she'd claimed she was traveling through. But tonight, after everything that had unraveled the slap, the appointment, the headlines her father had asked her directly, "Can we talk? Just the family." Sabine was late. Maya had warned her. "This is not a peace offering. This is a reckoning. Go in clear-eyed." So Calandra showed up. Clean face, simple black turtleneck. No agenda, no notebook, no handlers. Just herself. The version that used to exist before any of them knew how to pronounce Givenchy. Her younger brother Malcolm poked a fork at his salad. "So, I read that the CFDA thing went well." "It did," Calandra replied, offering no elaboration. Everett nodded once. "Saw the piece in Vogue, too." "Well written." Again, silence followed. No one wanted to admit that the real article was written in ink. They couldn't wash off the kind that detailed what they had ignored, enabled, or excused. Sabine entered 15 minutes late. No apology, not even a glance. She swept in with her usual understated grandeur, soft cream blouse, gold cuff bracelet, a face meticulously set like porcelain behind glass. But something was different. Her eyes were tired. Her walk just a half-beat slower. Her confidence dimmed beneath the surface. She sat directly across from Calandra. "Thank you for coming," Everett said, directing his attention equally to both daughters. "We haven't exactly had a proper conversation in a while." 7 years, Calandra corrected softly. "But who's counting?" Malcolm cleared his throat and stood. "Actually, I have an early shift tomorrow, so I think I'll leave you 3 to it." He was gone before anyone could protest. The door clicked behind him and the room seemed to shrink by half. Everett exhaled. "I want to start by saying I didn't know about the sketches, the portfolio, any of it." "You didn't ask," Calandra said, not with anger but with simple finality. "You never asked. I thought you were helping her, supporting the family. That's what you said you were doing." "No," she corrected, her voice steady. "That's what you said I was supposed to do." He looked down at his plate. Calandra's gaze flicked to Sabine, who still hadn't said a word. "You let them believe you did it all. You took my name off every design board, every credit list, every donor grant. You even used my student ID to get access to Parsons' library." Sabine flinched at the first visible crack in her expression. "And I let it happen," Calandra went on. "Because back then I thought it would be temporary. I thought we were helping each other, that I was just staying in the wings until I could find my own light. I didn't realize you were building the spotlight around me to block me out." Sabine set down her fork. "You always made it so easy. You didn't speak up. You didn't push back. I thought, maybe you didn't want to be seen." Calandra stared at her sister, stunned by the simplicity of the excuse. That wasn't silence. That was trust. Sabine looked genuinely caught off guard, as if the word had never entered her vocabulary in that context. Everett finally looked up again. "You gave up Parsons for us." "I didn't give it up," Calandra said. "It was taken. You told me verbatim, 'You're better with Mom and Sabine's the face.' You said she needed the shot more. I thought it was temporary, he murmured. Everything with Sabine is temporary until it benefits her. Then it becomes permanent. Calandra's voice never rose, but the weight of her words had the power of thunder under velvet. Sabine's voice was brittle now. I worked hard. No one said you didn't, Calandra said, but you didn't work alone, and you knew that. You always knew that. The room grew so quiet the faint hum of the refrigerator buzzed like static in the air. Sabine finally looked at her father, her face breaking just slightly. You were proud of me, and I was scared that if you saw the whole truth I'd lose that. Everett shook his head slowly. I raised you both. I should have been proud of both of you. Then why weren't you? Calandra asked. He didn't answer. She continued gentler this time. Dad, I don't need a parade. I don't want a throne. I just wanted my name back, my work, my story. Sabine's eyes welled for the first time, not performative tears, but the kind that come when the scaffolding of a carefully controlled narrative begins to collapse. I thought, if I acknowledged you publicly, it would erase everything I built. But it wouldn't, Calandra said. It would have made it stronger. There was a pause. I don't hate you, she added, almost surprising herself. But I don't trust you anymore, and that's going to take time. Sabine nodded. I know. Everett reached across the table toward Calandra's hand. I failed you. She didn't take his hand, but she didn't recoil either. You're learning, she said. That's enough for now. Dinner went unfinished. The duck remained untouched, but the room felt cleaner somehow, as if silence had finally been scraped away and replaced by something truer, if more raw. Later that night, as Calandra was getting ready to leave, Sabine walked her out to the front steps. She hesitated. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me, she said. Not yet. I'm not ready to offer it, Calandra replied, stepping out into the chilled air. But before she turned to go, she paused. You know, if you ever do decide to design something of your own from scratch, I'd be happy to see it. Sabine's lips pressed into a trembling line. Would you tell me if it was bad? Calandra smiled faintly. Absolutely. Then she walked into the night, no longer the woman behind the curtain, but the one who chose where to walk and when and why. The studio was small, sunlit, and imperfect. It didn't carry the sleek austerity of Morrow Atelier's former penthouse office or the bone-white walls of Fashion Week's backstage sanctuaries. Instead, it smelled faintly of linen graphite and chamomile tea. Bolts of fabric leaned in the corners like silent collaborators, and pinned sketches lined the corkboard, each one signed at the bottom, C. Morrow. This time, no sister's shadow loomed overhead. This time, her name didn't need permission. The sign on the window read, Marielle by Calandra, a name she'd whispered to herself for years in private, now etched in gold foil and reflected back by the city that once forgot her. It wasn't just a label. It was a resurrection. The soft knock on the glass was tentative. Maya slipped in, balancing a coffee and a bouquet of eucalyptus and baby's breath. I figured you wouldn't sleep, she said, setting the cup down. You've got first interviews today, right? Calandra nodded, adjusting a mannequin's shoulder line. And the collection preview in 2 weeks. Vogue's sending someone next Friday. Maya grinned. You're nervous. Terrified, Calandra admitted. But not the old kind. Not the kind that comes from being invisible. This is different. She looked down at the hem she was stitching, a gentle hand tracing along the seam. This is fear that comes with having something real to lose. Something that's mine. Maya gestured toward the design boards. These look like you. Like memory and strength had a child and decided to drape it in silk. Calandra laughed. That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me all year. The new line was a departure. Gone were the hard silhouettes. Sabine had favored the severe shoulder pads, the calculated austerity. Instead, Marielle whispered of heirlooms and quiet endurance. Dresses were cut in bias lines meant to move like breath. Hand embroidery recalled the patterns their mother stitched into dish towels. A blazer bore a stitched phrase in its lining, visible only when turned inside out. Invisible does not mean absent. Calandra named every piece after a moment in her life that she'd previously hidden. January porch light, a soft wool coat based on the one she used to wrap around herself when sketching late at night outside her mother's hospital window. Stitch line number 3, a crepe dress that traced the scar pattern of her arthritis surgeries, not with shame, but with reverence. Each item was a reclamation of time, of space, of identity. The week before launch, Elle ran a feature titled Legacy Reimagined: The Sister Who Stayed Silent Until Now. It included an image of Calandra standing in her studio, hands confidently crossed, framed by a rack of her own making. In the interview, she said, "This isn't about revenge. This is about release. I didn't want to take anything from anyone. I just wanted to finally offer something of my own." The public responded in droves. Orders began to stream in not mass-market chaos, but personal messages from women who saw themselves in the designs. One letter read, "I wore your blazer to my retirement party after 30 years in a job where they called me background support. I've never felt more seen. Even buyers who once favored Sabine's brand began reaching out. A boutique in Paris requested an exclusive capsule. A retired editor from Women's Wear Daily called the collection a triumph of restraint and soul." The night before the preview event, Calandra stood alone in the empty space she'd rented for the showing. It was a converted greenhouse tucked behind a bookbindery in Soho, glass walls, moss-lined floors, twinkling string lights across the ceiling like stars that remembered your name. She moved between the pieces, adjusting collars, straightening tags. Her mother would have loved this, she thought. Not the glamour, the care. She sat on the bench by the back, staring at the nameplate at the entrance. Marielle by Calandra. Not Morrow, not Sabine & Co., not assistant, not ghost, just hers. The next morning, the showing opened with a soft piano arrangement and no announcer. Just the sound of slow, graceful footsteps. Models moved through the room as if storytelling through fabric, no abrupt turns, no spectacle. Every piece carried intimacy as though it belonged to someone's memory before it was ever worn. Calandra stood quietly in a corner, not with the press, not with the buyers. She didn't need to be front and center. Not anymore. Her name was already stitched into every fold of the room. Midway through the showing, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Eleanor Vance, former chairwoman of the CFDA, and her old professor. The same woman who'd held up her sketches at the gala. "Congratulations," Eleanor said simply. Calandra blinked. I didn't know you were coming. I wouldn't have missed it." Eleanor looked around the room, then leaned in. "Do you remember what I said during your final critique at Parsons?" Calandra tried to recall. "You said I had a quiet style, that I would need to fight harder to be heard." Eleanor smiled. "I was wrong. Your work was never quiet. The world just wasn't listening yet." They stood there a moment longer. The music shifted to a slower tempo. In the background, a group of young design students whispered excitedly, pointing at a panel of sketches hanging by the entrance, each one signed C. Morrow. "I should go greet them," Calandra said. Eleanor nodded. "Yes, you're their future now." As Calandra walked across the floor, a calm settled over her. Not relief, not triumph, but the deep-rooted peace that comes from knowing you've finally stepped out of the wings, not by shoving anyone aside, but by refusing to shrink any longer. She wasn't here to prove Sabine wrong. She was here to prove herself right. It arrived in a plain cream envelope with no return address, no stylized logo, no monogrammed paper. Just her name, handwritten in narrow, slightly tilted cursive Calandra Morrow. For a moment, she almost didn't open it. She'd come to associate Sabine's presence with performance dramatic emails, media damage control, public gestures disguised as apologies. But this was quiet, and it didn't come with a press release. She slit the top with the edge of a pattern knife and unfolded the letter. "Cal," it began. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not writing for that. I'm writing because I spent the last 6 months trying to sew something without your hand sketch, without your lines, and lead without your compass. And everything I made fell apart. I watched you create Marielle with the kind of grace I never understood. You didn't scream. You didn't expose me. You just became the thing I always feared you might, the version of you that no one could ignore anymore." Calandra paused. The handwriting dipped in places as if written in starts and stops. It wasn't the scrawl of PR advisors. This was Sabine's actual pen. "You once asked me why I kept your name off the brand. I think I finally know. I didn't want to share the light, because I knew it would show just how much of it came from you." There was a long space before the next paragraph, as if Sabine had hesitated pen hovering. "I'd like to apply to the Marielle Fund. Not for show, not for clout, but because I never actually learned what you did, how to start from fabric and soul, not just marketing and posture. Maybe I'm too old to begin again, but if there's space for someone like me, I want to try. No expectation, no shortcuts. If I'm not chosen, I'll understand. But if you believe that legacy can change, maybe you'll consider mine worth rewriting." Sabine. Calandra reread it twice before folding it back into its envelope. Her first instinct wasn't anger. It was sadness, a kind of muted final sadness like hearing the echo of a song you once loved now faint from a neighboring room. It was the first time Sabine had asked for anything without assuming she'd be given it. She stared at the envelope, her fingers tracing the edges like a seam line she'd already stitched too many times. She didn't feel triumph. She felt tired. But beneath that, something unexpected clarity. Later that day in her studio, she called Maya in. "I got something from Sabine." Maya raised a brow. Another cease and desist. Calandra half smiled. "No, an application. To sue you for?" "No," she said, handing her the letter. "To apply for the scholarship." Maya read it in silence, her expression unreadable until she let out a long, low whistle. "Wow." "I'm not answering it," Calandra said. "Not directly, but I'm forwarding it to the scholarship team." Maya looked up. "You're serious?" "She asked to be evaluated like anyone else. That's what the fund is for. Fair starts, not revenge." Maya nodded slowly. "And if she gets in?" Calandra took a long sip of her tea, then folded the letter neatly again. "Then she'll finally have to work for something without using my name to get there." She sent the letter to her advisory team with a single line typed below. "Please process this like any other application. The Marielle Fund is about truth, not legacy correction, and not retribution. If she earns it, she earns it. That's the point." That evening, Calandra walked home through the brisk New York air. The city felt softer than it used to, less like a competition, more like a fabric she could finally fold into. She passed a bookstore window and paused when she saw a small display, Women Who Rewrote the Rules of Fashion. On the cover stood 5 portraits. Hers was the last, a sketch rather than a photo, charcoal-lined and elegant. Underneath it read, "Calandra Morrow, founder of Marielle 2025, Designer of the Year nominee." She didn't smile. She simply kept walking. The past didn't need to be avenged. It had already happened. But the future that was hers now. No permissions, no borrowed names, no quiet, invisible ink. And somewhere perhaps a woman like Sabine might finally start learning how to sew from scratch. The auditorium at Parsons buzzed with low chatter, a quiet murmur of anticipation that filled the air like warm static. Rows of students, faculty, alumni, and media had packed the space to hear the keynote address for the annual Future of Fashion Symposium. Some came for the inspiration. Others came for the curiosity. This was, after all, the first public keynote by Calandra Morrow, whose name had once only existed in the margins of someone else's fame. Backstage, Calandra stood in a simple, deep blue silk dress of her own design. No logos, no bold shoulders or high drama, just clean lines, graceful movement, and a silhouette that whispered rather than shouted. It was the kind of garment her mother would have called elegant without trying. Fitting, she thought. Her mother had always understood restraint better than spectacle. A student volunteer with a headset approached. "Ms. Morrow." "We're ready." Calandra gave a soft nod and stepped into the wings. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight warmed the center of the stage as her name was announced, not Sabine's sister or anonymous sketch artist, but simply Calandra Morrow. She walked slowly to the center, taking a breath before she began. "Good afternoon." She said, her voice calm and deliberate, the kind that didn't need to be raised to command attention. "When I was 20, I gave up my scholarship to Parsons." A few in the audience shifted. Some gasped softly, others already knew the story. But Calandra didn't pause. She kept going. "I didn't drop out. I didn't fail. I was asked to give my place to someone else, and I said yes quietly without protest. Because I thought sacrifice was a virtue. I thought love meant giving everything, even your future, and asking nothing in return." She looked out over the crowd, meeting the eyes of students leaning forward, professors, who now recognized her name from old evaluations, and press photographers, unsure if they should lift their cameras yet. "For years, I created in silence. My sketches appeared under someone else's name. My designs walked runways with another signature, and I told myself that was enough, that being part of something mattered more than being seen." A few heads nodded. A woman near the front clutched her scarf. But something shifted the day I realized I didn't want revenge. I didn't want fame. I just wanted my name back. The room was quiet now. No shifting, no whispers. Just attention. Deep, still, waiting. I've been asked why I didn't speak up sooner. Why I let it go on for so long. And the answer is simple: because I believed that talent was enough. That truth would eventually reveal itself. But the world doesn't work that way, especially not in industries where credit is currency and silence is easy to exploit. She took another breath. "I never wanted war. I still don't. But I do believe in restoration, in truth, in building something not just to be admired, but to be honest. That's why I started Marielle. Not to make headlines, not to compete, but to create a space where legacy is earned and remembered, not stolen or rewritten." She paused. Then, from a folder, she pulled a single sheet. "This," she said, holding it up, "is a sketch I drew when I was 19. A design inspired by my mother's Sunday dresses, simple cotton hems, embroidered collars. It was the first thing I ever created that felt like mine. It never made it to a runway, but it made me who I am." She turned to gesture behind her. The stage curtain lifted slowly, revealing a full wall lined with framed sketches, some old, some new. Each had been signed at the bottom in clear looping ink, designed by Calandra Morrow. There was no music, no applause yet, just the quiet rustle of emotion moving across the room. "I stand here not as someone who won," she said finally, "but as someone who reclaimed. And if you take anything from my story, let it be this: behind every unnamed sketch is a woman who still believed it mattered." She stepped back from the podium, and in that stillness, before the applause started, before the cameras flashed, before anyone stood, Calandra felt it. The final seam had closed. Not with confrontation, not with triumph, but with truth. And that was the walk she took off stage, not into fame, not into spotlight, but into something sturdier. Her own name. Her own light. Finally hers.